Chairman, Mr. Nick Griffin MEP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I noticed, well, someone sent me the other day an email with an article from Nigel Farage in it about how he's now been on Question Time 25 times. 25 times. Starting in, when was it, about 2006 he was first on Question Time. You know, this party, our party, we beat UKIP in the 2010 general election. You wouldn't think it, looking at the way the BBC treat them and us, but in the last general election, we beat UKIP in more places than they beat us. We got more votes than them, on average, in the average constituency. And yet the BBC sees fit to put Nigel Farage on 25 times, and other members of UKIP on other times. And for the British National Party, we get that one sorry farce, which wasn't a Question Time at all. That programme's been running 36 years, and they've never ever changed the format. It's always just been talking about the issues of the day. And as you know, when I was on Speaking for Us, it was just one long attack. When they had Gerry Adams on, IRA murderer, they had one question, basically, have you stopped ordering people to be shot or not? Then they went on to talk about transport and health service, all the usual things. But this party is treated absolutely differently by the BBC, by the whole British establishment. We're treated outrageously. Why? Because they've sold this country out. We're the only people who say they've sold this country out, because they give the people no choice at all. Issue after issue after issue, all three parties, there's not a cigarette paper to put between them. They haven't given the people a choice. We gave and have given the people of Britain back a real effective choice when it comes to election times. And for that, the people running the BBC absolutely hate us, which I'm really pretty pleased with. Because when you see the shocking mess they've made of our country, I wouldn't want their respect. I'm going to get rid of this thing, because it's doing horrible things, isn't it? Right, get rid of that. I wouldn't want the respect of those people for what they've done to this country, for how they've let this country down. I really wouldn't do. So I'm very proud and pleased that we stand alone, and that the BBC hate us so much they won't let us on. Now, when I was on my way up here, I was thinking, well, I'll make the same speech I've made at these other fundraising events around the country, because people here haven't heard it, and it's about what it's like to be an MEP and the different areas in which being an MEP for the British National Party has made a real difference. And I can tell you that in a number of ways it has made a real difference to people in the northwest of England, to people further afield, to the whole British political scene. But I'm not going to do that, because Derek from British National Party TV and his team, they've come a long way, and they want new footage, because it's not just the people watching here tonight, but there's hundreds, thousands of people will see the footage of this event in the next few weeks. They'll be impressed by a tremendous show that's being put on by your team here, running things in the northeast, but also they want to hear something new. So I'll talk about something new. So I thought about Mr. Farage's proud boast of having been on Question Time 25 times. I thought, okay, well, we're not doing a Question Time tonight, but I just picked up a paper and I thought, well, to show that if we were treated fairly, we'd have interesting things to say, useful things to say, things that an awful lot of members of the public would agree with. I thought I'll talk about just a few of the issues in today's paper. And perhaps if we get time, if one or two of you want to think about an additional question at the time, throw that in as well, just to show that it's not fixed. This is live. So the first thing, I want to pick up a bit more on what Adam was saying about the Lee Rigby murder trial. And I won't go over the appalling circumstances of that poor lad's death, but I want to talk about a few of the things that arise. What that really signifies is that immigration into Britain has been the most catastrophic disaster in the history of this country and of our people. You've got to understand that Lee Rigby in our capital city, as a young white man in our capital city, was a minority in the capital of our country already. Walking down the streets of Woolwich, if you are of English descent, you are a minority in those streets. And that's the reality of life in South East London. And we never asked for it, we never voted for it, no politician ever had a mandate for it. Whenever the British people have been asked, they've said no, this is madness, shut the door. But because this tiny, corrupt, out-of-touch ruling elite decided they're going to have mass immigration, because of that Lee Rigby died. Because his alleged killers, we have to say alleged at present, weren't even from this country. They're Christian African immigrants who hadn't been here that long, and yet we see where this ends up. And obviously we've got a particular problem with this aggressive form of Islam, which is sweeping this country more and more. But let's face it, we have also got a problem, well, this party has a problem, and I'm very proud to say it, because no one else will dare say it. We haven't just got a problem with Muslim immigration, we've got a problem with all mass immigration into this country, because this country is full. And whether they're black Africans or Pakistanis or Poles, this country is full. It's unfair on our workers, it's unfair on our taxpayers, and it's unfair, grotesquely unfair, on our children and their children and their children, because the politicians are giving our country away, and it's got to stop. And more specifically about this attack, and if you've read the details, finally the papers have started talking about this trial now. When Clive Jefferson and Dawn Charlton were up for their alleged offence of talking about peanuts and polls and so on, every time they went into court, into the preliminary hearings, there's a TV camera from the local TV network there to record it, every time they went in. In the case of these two creatures, they've been up to court time and time and time again, and the media haven't said a word about it, because they don't want to say a word about it. They have to now. Now it's really broken, this story, and we've helped it break as well. We've helped really push it forward. A number of your online activists, you've been working hard to do that, and they've realised, well, they can't even now try and cover it up. So now the trial really proper has started. They're finally giving it some of the coverage it deserves. So that's at least something. But they're not covering certain aspects of it. In the news from the first day of the full trial, it came out, yes, the alleged killer, he went and bought the knives and the chopper in Lewisham, a day or so before the attack. And so what's with Lewisham? It's somewhere in South London, yeah. But what they haven't put together, and the police have done nothing about, and we know that for sure, is that Lewisham also has a mosque, the Lewisham Islamic Centre. And that mosque was used regularly by that alleged killer, the one who just went and bought those deadly weapons in a hardware shop in Lewisham, so the connection's there. That was used regularly by him. And what we campaigned about, in fact we had a whole demonstration about it, Adam and myself and others were nearly arrested down there for wanting a demonstration to draw attention to the fact that this mosque in Lewisham, that man or creature went to regularly, runs a martial arts course. And it uses a form of martial arts which uses knives and choppers. And I looked the other day at the website of that mosque, and they're still running that form of martial arts. And they talk about it. They say that for the children and the women, this is self-defense. But for the brothers, for the young ones, for the young men, the men of fighting age, it's martial arts. It's not self-defense. For them, it's martial arts. And really, the front pages of the story shouldn't be telling us what they did, because we all knew that already. What the front pages of the newspapers should be at present is about the fact that despite that most appalling murder, the police and the authorities are still allowing the mosque where that creature learnt his skills to train other young Muslims to kill other young soldiers in Britain. That's the story that should be told. Hang on. And there's another story which should be told here, or related to that. And it might surprise you to know that I had a telephone conversation for an hour the other day with a British-born Muslim who got in touch with this party a week or so before, and Alwyn Deacon, our dispatch manager, has been to meet him and so on. And this chap, he's involved in a school in Birmingham, and it's a school which is basically 50% Indigenous and 50% Muslim. And this fellow's involved, he's involved with the governors, and he's got in touch with us because over the last few months, a gang, and it is a gang, of radical Muslim fanatics and Labour supporters have taken over that school. The former headmaster, who was a Sikh, who of course they hate almost as much as they hate us, they've driven him out. This is a school which is still 50% English, or in Birmingham actually English and Irish. It's still 50% British, it's still 50% white. There's not one of our people on the board of governors. They've got rid of them all. It's wall-to-wall Muslim fundamentalists. And this chap's got in touch with us to say how angry he is about it, and he's been trying to get the newspapers to run the story. He's been trying to get the police interested because they're supposed to be interested in the intelligence possibilities of radicalising young people. None of them wanted to know until we ran the story on BNP TV a couple of weeks ago, and now at least it's got in the papers. Now at least people know about it. But he said that there's lots of other members of his community feel the same way. He was telling me about a young Muslim mother, and he said she's a very devout Muslim, but she's got kids at another school in Birmingham where the same thing is going on, and she's terrified because she's got quite young sons, and she can see if they grow up in a school which is run by these Muslim fundamentalist fanatics, by the time they're 15 or 16, they'll be fantasising about going on jihad and hacking the heads off British soldiers. And by the time they're 18, they'll have gone and done it. And she said, and this chap said to me, that there's so many people, you'd never believe how many people in our community, the Muslim community, have looked, and they're so scared, they're now looking at the British National Party, saying they're the only people who understand it, who've got the balls to stand up and would do something about it. Absolutely astounding. And I said to him, well, what proportion of your community has been as radicalised as this, to be that this is a real problem? And he said, well, it's large and it's growing. He said, do you know why it's growing? I said, well, let me stop you, I'll tell you, and then we'll see if I'm right. I said, I think it's growing primarily because every new mosque that's built in Britain is built with Saudi Arabian money. Yes. Wow. And the Saudi Arabians, as several people in the audience understand, are not an ordinary Muslim. They're actually a fanatical, crank Islamic sect with whom, by a bizarre quirk of fate, they're sitting on the biggest pool of oil anywhere in the damn universe, in all probability, and it's given them money to go from being a tiny handful of very dangerous cranks who used to murder other Muslims, who used to murder other Arabs, and it's now given them the power to murder anyone they want to all around the world. And they are committed to taking over this country in particular, but the world in general, for their version of radical Islam. So I said to him, I think that a large part of the problem is that our government, this government, the last government, the whole political elite, because not one of them has ever said it, they're allowing these people to buy power and influence over their own community, and no one's doing anything about it. And he said, that's absolutely right. Why is your government so mad? I said, I can certainly tell you that one. It's because Saudi Arabian money and Qatari money, Gulf oil money, is one of the few things still propping up this country's broken, bankrupt economy, and they've bought the politicians. They're helping to finance the country by buying up, as the country's privatised. They own, for instance, they own the port of Dover. They own vast chunks of this country's infrastructure, and because our politicians have ruined this country's economy, they feel they've got no choice but to sell this country to the Saudi Arabians. But it comes at a price, because of course when they make money out of the assets they bought, it goes over there, doesn't stay in this country, and it also means that what they want gets done. So they were desperate to have the British Air Force turned into Al-Qaeda's Air Force in Syria, to bomb Syria into the hands of exactly the same kind of creatures as murdered Lee Rigby. Because they weren't just homegrown cranks. They weren't some strange, weird thing. They're just in the mainstream of radical Wahhabi Islam, which, thanks to the money of Saudi Arabia and the treason of our politicians and the cowardice of our police force and the sheer deceit of our mass media, those people now have what this Muslim told me. He said, I reckon that they've taken over 60% of the Sunni population of this country. That's 60% of about 2.5 million people, at least. And actually probably a lot more than that. That's how dangerous this radicalisation already is in our country. So what happened to Lee Rigby wasn't something carried out by a couple of people who don't represent the Muslim community, which is what you hear from the likes of Cameron and all the rest of them. And Tommy Robinson with his Quillian bunch. They're all of them saying, it's only a handful of them, don't really worry, we're just going to deal with the extremists. Yes, we've got to deal with the extremists, but it's 60% of their whole damn population, which doesn't mean we've got to think everyone walking down the street is an enemy, because some of them are in the 40%. And if people go out and attack them, it'll push more into the extremist camp. There has to be a political solution to this and an economic solution to this, and we have to keep on pushing to get our politicians and our media to own up to the problem, to admit to the problem, and understand there will be more Lee Rigbys as long as they allow foreign fanatics to fund the mosques in Britain. There will be more Lee Rigbys as long as they allow foreign fanatics to preach in the mosques in Britain. There will be more Lee Rigbys as long as the people who can carry out attacks like this know that the worst they're going to get is 40 years in prison. The only answer to that is they have to know there has to be the death penalty without a shadow of a doubt. And then we get something done. Which brings me on really to another point in terms of what the British people want to see and hear, and that is that they want justice for Lee Rigby. They want justice for his family, for his memory, and they want justice because justice means a deterrent to it puts other people off, and justice brings a community together by showing everybody, the whole world and the community, that we have certain values. There are certain lines that if you cross the line of our society, we exact the most terrible retribution. That has to be done, because if you're not prepared to fight for your values, if you're not prepared, if necessary, and under the right circumstances, to kill for your values, then your values are valueless and you will lose your country. So there has to be the death penalty for people like the killers of Lee Rigby. And not because they're black, not because they're Muslim. There's white vermin in this country who are living very comfortably in prisons right now, facing a far more comfortable winter and a far more comfortable Christmas than the 40,000 pensioners who are going to die of cold. And creatures like the murderer of those two poor little girls in Soham. People like Myra Hindley, were she still alive. Those monsters should not be living at the expense of the British taxpayer, comfortably in a warm cell. They should hang by the neck until they are dead.
Yeah!
But because we don't have democracy in this country, it's not going to happen. Because you've got a Labour Party which is completely against capital punishment. You've got a Liberal Party, the Lib Dems, who are completely against it. And you've got a Tory party whose Prime Minister, come election time, will say, I'll tell you what, we'll allow a free vote in Parliament. Knowing damn well that when the Labour Party are all going to vote against it, the Lib Dems are both going to vote against it after the next election, and half the Tory party are going to vote against it at all. He knows damn well that it's not going to happen. It's a sham. 80–90% of the British people want a return of the death penalty, not for every murder. The crime of passion type murder doesn't deserve the death penalty. A fight in a street where someone ends up dying in a fight between fellas, that doesn't deserve a death penalty. But premeditated, cold-blooded murder in terrorism, the murder of little children who've been brutally raped and so on, under those circumstances, of course. Everybody agrees that. Especially when, with DNA evidence and CCTV, there is now no possibility of executing the wrong person, which was always the moral question. It was always the difficult question. It's no longer a difficult question. As long as there is CCTV footage, and with Britain being the most spied-on country in the world, that's generally the case. Unless, of course, you or a member of your family happen to become the victims of an anti-white racist attack, in which case I will guarantee you, from experience of talking to dozens of families over the last few years to whom this has happened, that the police will say, no, sorry, it wasn't working. But generally, in the case of a murder, yes, it's working. And DNA evidence always works. So there is no longer any possibility of hanging the wrong person, and therefore it's not a question of is it morally right, it's morally wrong not to. Under those circumstances. And when they say, oh, would you take a life? Yes, it's right to take a life if that person is guilty of something so foul, and it's a way to save the lives of other people who otherwise become the victims of brutal thugs who think, I can do it because I'll probably get away with it, and even if I don't, I'm going to be okay for the rest of my life. It's time to stop, but we will only get what the British people want when the British people understand that they've got to get rid of the people who won't let them have what they want and put someone like us in instead. The time will come. But let's move on, because not all criminals look like criminals. You know, the stereotypical criminal, if they want to show a criminal on television, you know what they'll look like, yeah? Always white, exclusively white, yeah? White, short hair, working class, yeah? Because it's white working class people are the criminals according to them. I know it's not true, you know it's not true, but that's how they present them. Most criminals, the real criminals in this country, the serial criminals, cannot be identified by their short haircuts, by the way they speak, or by their tattoos, or whatever. Most criminals in Britain, the serious ones, wear very smart suits and ties and Gucci shoes and designer watches, because the real criminals in this country are the people running the banking system. Yes, white-collar criminals, Gucci criminals, Versace criminals, the people specifically running the banking system. And in today's paper, there's a story there about how, despite the fact that they brought this country to its knees economically, and yes, it is the politicians who gave away our industry, who turned the northeast of England into an industrial desert. That's the politicians. They did the damage. But it's been finished off recently by the banks, who caused so much disaster with their greed and their corruption and their banking crash, that even today and for the next 20 years, the ordinary poor people of Britain are going to be paying for it. When you look at the pain being inflicted on people by the bedroom tax, and there's plenty of people having their lives ruined, having this Christmas ruined by the bedroom tax, because the rich and the powerful say, oh, well, if someone's got more rooms than they need, it's right they should move house, or it's right they should downsize, or it's right they should pay. But they don't look at the reality, the facts behind it. They're so desperate to get the money. So the reality of the people being hit by the bedroom tax is, for instance, a pair of grandparents whose kids are left, but the grandchildren come to stay once a month or a couple of times a month, and therefore they need a bedroom. So it's not a spare bedroom at all. It's a bedroom their family, or two bedrooms, their family actually need. Or if you've got a husband and wife, they split up. Happens so often, very often because of the pressure of debt, but for whatever reason they split up. And they've got kids, so they've now got two houses. And he's in one bedroom, in one house, and she's in a bedroom in the other house. But the kids go between mum and dad, and there's a couple of kids, they each need a bedroom. But oh no, there's now going to be a bedroom tax, and they've each got to pay for the privilege of having their kids live decently in their own house. And all the money that's going to be gouged out of the poor people of Britain over the next year with a bedroom tax is all because the banksters broke this country's economy. And the amount of money they'll get out, well, it's roughly speaking 100 million a year they say they're going to get. Sorry, no, 400 million. 400 million a year is what it's going to bring in, just under £500 million. This country spent hundreds of billions of pounds bailing out the banks. And because they spent hundreds of billions bailing out the banks, they're going to gouge the poor people of Britain hundreds of millions, a thousandth of it, to try to claw some of it back. That's the level of the banker's crime. And because the banker's crime doesn't leave someone bleeding in a gutter when they've stolen their handbag, like an ordinary mugging, people somehow think it's not criminal. Yes, it is when they've stolen hundreds of billions of pounds and wasted hundreds of billions of pounds of this country. And every last saving the British government's trying to make by cutting this and slashing that doesn't begin even to make up for the enormous amount that's been lost because of the banks. And in the papers today, they say that despite all of that, 2,700 banksters this year alone would have taken home each more than £1.6 million in salary and bonuses. Most people in this country don't earn that in a lifetime, and they get it in 1 year. They ruin this country. They devastate the lives of millions of ordinary people, and then these bastards take £1.6 million home each. They're the criminals. And no one dares say it. Actually, it's the reason we're really attacked. It's the reason I'm not allowed on Question Time. It's the reason we get such a bad press. It's not because we're racist, because we're not racist. This party has never hurt anyone for being a different colour or a different religion, for being different. But the Blair government, with the backing of most MPs still sitting in Parliament, including the current Prime Minister, they murdered hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Just because they were Arabs and just because they were Muslims and just because they lived in another country, they murdered hundreds of thousands of them with our weapons and our money. They're the criminals, they're the war criminals, they're the real racists. But because they stand for the banking system, because they allow the banksters to get away with it, they're okay and we're condemned, because that's how much in this country money talks. And it's talking a great deal. And let's get this clear about the banks. That yes, this party would stop those kind of obscene bonuses. And the ones who created the mess in the first place, they wouldn't be bankers anymore. They'd be cleaning toilets, doing something useful for the first time in their lives. But that isn't still our big quarrel with the banking system. Even if they took a sensible amount of money for a responsible job and so on, we would still want a radical reform, demand a radical reform of the banking system, because in very simple terms, banking in most of the world, and certainly in Britain for hundreds of years, has involved essentially private banks creating money out of thin air, in the old days on a ledger, and these days with a few clicks of a computer mouse. They create money out of thin air and then they lend it to the rest of us at interest, at usury, so we have to pay them back the capital sum and the interest as well. It's the biggest fraud in human history. And as nationalists, we talked about it for years and for years, decades. They said it doesn't happen like that. And now with quantitative easing, if you actually read the financial sections of the papers, they quite happily talk about the Bank of England is going to print out of thin air another £100 billion, but then they're going to lend it. And they effectively give it to the banks, and then they beg the banks to lend it at high interest rates still to businesses. And our position with this is very simple. Since the Bank of England can create money out of nothing, it should create money out of nothing, but it shouldn't be then given to the banks to lend to the public to make even more money for the bloody banks. It should be used by the government to spend it on serious construction. For instance, creating a new generation of ultra-safe thorium power plants so the lights don't start going out in a few years' time. And in doing that, we'd keep the lights on. We create real jobs for real workers. We create a new nuclear industry in this country using ultra-safe nuclear power. And we could put the Greek back in Britain. on that alone. And there's so many things this country needs money for. Really constructive, rebuilding British industry, to bring the jobs back to places like Tyneside and so on. You must know yourself, there's still just time to do it, because you've got men of 40, 50, 60 who've worked in serious industry, who still know what it takes, who still know how to make machine tools. Another 10 years' time, who's going to teach the apprentices then? There'll be no one. There's still just time. If we had the money, there's still time to rebuild real industry in this country and bring back jobs and bring back wealth. And the investment's just waiting there for a government to say to the banks, you know what, you're not going to create money and then hog it all to yourself and demand interest. You're going to create money, because we have to have banks. You're going to create it, and we're going to spend it rebuilding this country. And it can be done, it's going to be done, but it can only be done by us. And now let's move on. One of the things this country needs money for is a proper health service. It shouldn't ideally be paid out of the money that's created, because the money that's created needs to go to rebuild British industry. But once you've rebuilt British industry, once you've got people working again in jobs that are really productive and really bring money into the country and are therefore well paid, you'll have tax. You have a bigger tax take, and out of a tax take, we can run a health service, because that's how we used to run a health service. Not by borrowing. You can't keep doing that. You have to have enough money coming in to be able to take some to help people who can't help themselves, which is what the health service is supposed to be. There's a shocking story in the papers today of a chap called Grant Clark, who's suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. So he's still got it, but he's desperate in hospital. And his wife, because the hospital down in Kent wouldn't do anything about the fact he was lying for days in his own excrement, his wife in the end took in a camera and secretly filmed it in desperation to try to get it sorted out. But that's not a one-off case. Our health service is on the point of near collapse. The lowest level nurses are still getting pathetic pay rises, but they're getting little pay rises. The doctors are still getting enormous increases in money, but the skilled nurses, the ones who make it really all tick, they haven't had pay rises in many cases for 9 years. 9 years of no pay rises when you've got inflation at about 3% a year is, when you compound it up, it's about a 30% pay cut. A 30% pay cut over 10 years for doing a job which every year is worse and worse and worse, because there's fewer and fewer staff, there's more and more foreigners making more and more demands and clogging the things up. It's absolute hell. The health service is collapsing. And here again we come to another bunch of criminals, back to the politicians, because the health service is not dying. Dorothy spoke of it briefly and she spoke. The health service isn't dying, the health service is being murdered. It's deliberate by the politicians and by the common purpose type bureaucrats. They're doing it deliberately, because years ago, when they decided to deindustrialise the northeast of England, something obviously happened. You remember how what they used to call people who worked in factories? What they used to call men? Hands. Yep. The British working class were hands for the ruling elite to make money out of us. And if they're not going to have you working in a factory anymore, how are they going to make money out of you? And when the ruling elite decided to stop having this country make things, you don't think they decided to stop making money out of us, do you? Of course not. Because they see themselves as shepherds, and shepherds always fleece the sheep. It's what they do. So when they decided they deindustrialised Britain, they didn't give up on making money. They just thought, we'll make money in different ways. And the City of London will make money, for a little while. But in the end, we'll make money out of other things. And if you're not making money out of what people make, out of what they do, you can only make it out of how they live, by privatising the houses. And what used to be council houses are now housing associations, and in 5 years' time they will all be part of private let-for-profit empires. But most of all, if you want to make money out of people, what better way than to make it out of their health, or rather out of their ill health? And they decided a decade or more ago, when this country signed up to the World Trade Organisation's rules, that governments have to get out of providing health for people. They have to get out of provided housing for people. It's all got to be privatised. They signed up to that. The Tory party, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and UKIP agree with it. They all agreed that this country should be privatised, lock, stock and barrel. But they also knew there's no chance of the British people accepting the privatisation, especially of the health service. It's too dear to people's hearts. There's too much emotion about it. Even if actually it would be a good thing, it could not be sold to the British public. So how, therefore, to privatise the health service? How to let the Bupas and all the rest of them, the private hospitals, come in and take all the good bits? How to let that happen? Only one possible way, and it's how these people always work. They have a solution which they know is unacceptable to the rest of us. How do you sell an unacceptable solution? You create such a terrible problem that people demand a solution. So they had to create a problem, and the problem is the destruction of the health service. So that poor chap lying in his own excrement in Kent and all the thousands of others just like him up and down the country today are not the victims of a mistake, not the victims of running out of money. They're victims of a deliberate policy to so destroy the National Health Service that in the end people demand that it's privatised. And that is a crime. It's a crime against the taxpayers of this country. It's a crime against the people in the hospitals, against the patients. It's a crime against their families. It's a crime against the nursing staff. It's a crime, it's a crime, it's a crime against our people. And the people responsible for that crime, the people responsible for the piecemeal privatisation of the health service, under the present ruling elite, they serve as a cabinet minister. They make the decisions to privatise another chunk. And when they leave, they end up on the board of one of the private health companies. They're criminals. Criminals, and you can look through the list. If you look at the people on the boards of these companies, you will find MP after MP after MP, cabinet minister, retired cabinet minister after retired cabinet minister. I tell you, they're crooks. They shouldn't be on the boards. They should be in prison. Finally, I want to come back to the point of the European Parliament and MEPs and our membership of the European Union. And this party has said from its very inception that we should not be in the European Union. It was never meant for Britain. It's never any good for Britain. We would get Britain out. I was, as a young nationalist activist, I was part of the referendum campaign in 1975, when nationalists then campaigned to get Britain out. When almost every single person, all the MEPs of UKIP, they were all in the City of London in those days. They were all in favour of Britain going into the European Union because they thought it would open up more markets. They thought they could make more money that way. And they've only become against the European Union when they found that the European Union wants to impose regulations on their business. That's why Nigel Farage is now against the European Union, because he was a commodity broker. And he was allowed by the British ruling elite to do whatever he damn well wanted, making any money anywhere he wanted, anyhow he wanted. And the European Union, he complains, broke his business by coming in and imposing regulations. And actually most of those regulations were right and necessary and good. But the problem is they should have been imposed by a British government under British democratic control, not by a bunch of unelected foreigners. That's the problem with the European Union. So we've always said we should get Britain out, and it's in the papers today that the referendum bill has now passed through the Houses of Parliament, through the House of Commons. So therefore, we're now well on the way to being promised a referendum in 2017. And everyone's going to say, oh, isn't that wonderful? And you might say it'll never happen. I take a different position. I'd say it is going to happen. There will be a referendum in 2017, and the answer will be stay in the European Union, because that referendum will be rigged. So to paraphrase, a fair referendum will never happen. An honest referendum will never happen. We will never have our chance to have our say, and the majority of the British people who instinctively, or if there's a proper fair debate, would say yes, we must get Britain out. We must take back our freedom and our right to control our own economy, the right to guard our own borders, the right to have our own court system, the right to rule ourselves. They'd say yes to all of that. They'd say yes to getting Britain out, but it's not going to happen because that referendum will not be fair. And this party will go into the European elections and into the general election of 2015, saying to people, we do not offer you a referendum. If you vote for us, you're not going to get a referendum. If you vote for us, we will take Britain out. And just to conclude on this, I'll tell you why I'm so convinced that it'll be a fraud. Not least because, as I said a few minutes ago, when I was 16 and a young nationalist campaigner in the election, I saw for myself how they rigged the election. I'll tell you and everyone watching this how they will rig it, because it's already telegraphed that every house will get a couple of booklets. This is logical, isn't it, in a debate? You'll get a booklet from the yes people, whatever the issue is, and a booklet from the no people. And they'll be the same thickness, the same size. It's like in the Hartlepool mayoral election, probably. It'll be the same, it'll be fair. But no, it won't, because every house will get 3 booklets. Happened in 75, it'll happen again. They'll get the booklet from the yes people, the booklet from the no people, and they'll get the booklet from the government. And this is the government after its very careful and responsible deliberations, and after the government under Mr Cameron, God help us, has been and stamped his eyes, stamp. He'll have stamped all over Europe, yes. Do you know when this referendum comes up, Britain will just be at the end of a 6-month period when, just as part of Buggins' turn, we will have been the bosses, technically, of the European Union. We'll have been the head, but we'll have run it for 6 months, or been the main people. We'll have had the chair, is what it is, actually. We won't have run it. We'll have had the chair for 6 months. And therefore, for 6 months, the British public will have seen the Prime Minister bouncing to and fro and stamping his little foot, telling them, Britain, we will have our way. So the British government booklet will say, we've renegotiated it. We listened to you. We understood your concerns. We've listened. And we've got this great deal. So vote for the great deal, because if you don't, you're all going to lose your jobs and your pensions, because Britain will go down the tubes. So the yes campaigners will be saying, vote yes to stay in. And the question will be rigged. I don't know how they'll rig the question. It won't be a straight in or out. It'll be rigged so it's biased. And then there'll be the people saying staying in, 1 booklet. The people saying get out, 1 booklet. But the British government saying stay in, another booklet. Also, when I was a youngster in this campaign, for every £1 that those of us who wanted to retain British freedom had to spend, the people campaigning for a yes vote to stay in had £11. And it'll be the same again, because although there's a few chunks of the City of London, like Nigel Farage, who think they'd be better off out, the vast majority of the captains of British industry want to stay in, because the captains of British industry are no longer British. For instance, the Japanese car firms, for whom I know people in the northeast of England work, and they're glad to work and they're proud to work, but they will say, if you leave the European Union, those firms will shut, because we'll take them to Hungary or somewhere like that. And whether they would or whether they wouldn't doesn't matter. They will terrify people, because the impact of taking those firms out of places already poor, the knock-on effect means everyone with a pub, everyone with a travel agent, everyone with a Christmas tree selling shop, anyone who works in any of those places is going to think, I daren't vote to get out, because if I do, I'm voting to lose my job. So that referendum will be rigged. They will get their result to stay in, and then they'll say, so you've been asked, sit down and shut up. And that'll be it. We'll never get the right again. And that's why we have to say, no referendum. We just want to get Britain out, to get back control over our country, to shut the borders before we're absolutely swamped by these Roma. And I've seen them in Brussels. And if you think that what we've already had is bad, if you think that there's problems with the Muslim communities in parts of around here, if you think there's problems with the Poles coming in and actually working hard and doing a decent job, but taking our jobs, that's the problem. If you think you've got problems with them, you wait until you see these pickpocket scum. The level of lowlife is such that the young, radicalised punk Muslim scum operating in towns up and down Britain trying to have sex with young girls target our community. The Roma do it and sell their own children for the same thing. You are talking about a level of human being, something completely different to anything we've ever seen in this country before. They have no place in a civilised society. They don't have the faintest conception of how to live in a human society. And they are persecuted in Eastern Europe for a very good reason, that they are simply a very unpleasant people. And when people find themselves living next to criminal scum, they demand the police take action, and then they call it discrimination, and they say there's prejudice against them. Of course there is prejudice against people who behave like that. They are a population, I don't know how one can begin to describe them. All I can say is we do not want them in this country. Not a single one of them. Every single one of them is here or now needs to be on the first plane or boat home for the protection of this country, and even for the protection of their own kids. That shows you what kind of people we are dealing with. And we need to get out of the European Union, because it's the only way to secure our borders, and that is it's the most key reason, isn't it? Yes. Why on earth should people who work and work and work, or pensioners who've worked a lifetime and paid in, be afraid to walk down the streets of our towns, our cities, for fear of being mugged, for fear of being attacked, even for fear of the aggressive begging? Why should it be? But it's going to be because those people are coming, and there's nothing Cameron can do to keep them out. There's nothing any British government can do to keep them out while we are members of the European Union. And that is why this party says and pledges no vote, no referendum. We're simply coming out and taking back our country. Thank you.